This conference will now be recorded.
Well, my name is Mindy Espinosa. I'm with a company called UVDI. We sell ultraviolet devices and have for many years prior to COVID, which might be a surprise to some who've really just started into the realm of UV in the last year or so. So prior to working for UVDI, I've been in this industry for about a little over 20 years. It used to be more fun to introduce how long I'd been in the industry until now it dates me. But yeah, this is a unique situation we all find ourselves in. So I appreciate everybody jumping online to learn here. I am still a relationship person, so I look forward to the day when I can meet you in person and present face to face. And I find that to be more effective. But yeah, if you have questions along the way, and I'm sure we'll entertain some questions at the end, I'm definitely interested in hearing them. With any presentation I give, I kind of like to lead off with the fact that one of the best things about this industry is the fact that we're all constantly learning new things, and we're all presented with new data. And I'm kind of a giant nerd, and I love that. So if you hear anything in the presentation that makes you question, or that you've heard conflicting information, or have new information to add as well, I'm definitely open to that we can have conversation at the end of the presentation, and you can reach out to me directly to have those conversations. I definitely want to make sure that I am conveying the right messages, and if there's anything of question, I would like to know now so I can learn more and do our best in the future. So all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation. So pardon me. So what you're seeing on the screen now is just a list of various air contaminants, just talking about the relative particle size of different types of air contaminants. So even though UV is used for a lot of different purposes, we're going to talk what's most on people's mind as an example. For much of the presentation, we're going to talk about viruses, specifically the coronavirus, because that's kind of what's at the forefront of everybody's thoughts these days. That being said, I also am going to kind of lay the groundwork for why different types of pathogens, including viruses, bacteria, and other biological agents, molds and funguses, can be effectively combated with UV, and why that's important to IAQ. There's a habit many of us have had throughout the industry of thinking of indoor air quality more in terms of air exchanges, more in terms of VOCs, odors, things like that. And it seems, and we're kind of learning this now, that there hasn't been a ton of research and focus on biological contaminants as an issue of indoor air quality, unless you're working specifically in healthcare or lab settings up until now. So this is a good opportunity for us to improve our processes in understanding and in providing a better, cleaner air environment, including biological contaminants. So the chart here, I'm going to pop back and forth to a couple slides, so bear with me, please. But when we're talking, note this 0.3 line. That'll be familiar to anybody who's really dealt with much in the realm of filtration. I'm going to pop back and forth here. So what you're looking at now is just the standard 52.2 MERV chart and the various MERV ratings and their efficiencies. So the 0.3 line there is showing range 1, and that's just kind of highlighted for that region. That's where MERV ratings begin on the chart, and then go up to 10. So jumping back to the prior chart, so that's the emphasis on the red line is that 0.3 number. So, and you're visible to the naked eye realm, we've got our dust, pollens, molds, yeast cells. Virtually any filter in a commercial setting, your MERV 7, MERV 8 filters are pretty effective at eliminating those larger particles. when you're talking more along the lines of what we're seeing now, we're seeing an increase in MERV 13 filtration as a minimum filtration level in various locations. At very minimum, I see on the small commercial rooftop units is MERV 8 in most markets, MERV 7, MERV 8. So we're getting a 70% efficiency range in the 3 to 10. But let's look down lower to lower particle sizes, and we're getting less than 20 in your, old traditional lighter levels of filtration. When we pop up to the MERV 13 level, you're getting 85 at that 1 to 3 range and 50 at the 0.3 to 1. So I'm going to bounce back to this chart. It's important to note that when we're talking about coronavirus, there's still a lot of research that's going on, and people are still trying to quantify with precision, and multiple third-party validated studies are trying to understand all of the different aspects of the virus. So viruses in general range from a 0.01 to a 0.15 roughly range. Most of the time, viruses and other small particles like that don't travel around in the space on their own. They tend to agglomerate with other particles within a space or an environment, and then you'll have larger sizes of particles together. What some studies are trying to dig into a little bit more is at what various points in the viral reproductive cycle and at what various points when we're coming into contact with air are the precise particle sizes, and there are some ranges given in that, and some of the ranges range from the 0.3 level, and some go all the way up and are saying 0.5 to 0.7. In any case, it's not a super precise science quite yet with regard to coronavirus. Pardon me. That was a well-placed cough. Say coronavirus and then cough. That's great. To get to the realm of the 95% range or greater, you'd have to bump up your filtration to MERV 17, MERV 16 rather, to get a 95% disinfection, or 95% filtration, I should say, not disinfection. And in any case, we're capturing live particles in filters at this point. So a few questions arise, and that's at what point are we capturing, at what level of combination with other particles and agglomeration are we capturing? When we capture, and we're, we have a tendency sometimes to let filters get loaded and sometimes particles come through or break through. And then when we're changing filters, are we, knocking off a portion of live pathogen into an airstream? Are we potentially contaminating those who are changing the filters? So some questions may arise there. So to be very clear, UV manufacturers are not opposed to particulate filtration. In fact, most responsible UV manufacturers recommend a high level, a minimum level of a MERV 8 filter prior to their system to be able to make sure that the system does not get kind of bogged down with dirt or debris or damaged by debris. So UV and filtration go hand in hand. You should not have UV without filtration. To make another point of clarity, UV is not a particulate filter at all. So you definitely need to meet the needs of your system with the appropriate level of particulate filtration. A real advantage that we're kind of seeing with alternate types of filtration and air treatment, airstream disinfection specifically, is the challenge that we have when we have those commercial rooftops, many of which are still operating. Kudos to the rooftop unit manufacturers, still operating decades down the road, and were designed specifically with the MERV 7, MERV 8 type filtration in mind. They don't have the space for higher levels of filtration, and they don't have the fan energy for higher levels of filtration. And so providing a means where you're not adding a significant amount of pressure drop. Most UV systems for airstream disinfection are 0.05 inches or less of pressure drop added. So it provides an alternate and supplemental means. It's not to replace filtration. So I pulled these charts. This is pre-coronavirus. I built this presentation and I found some of these charts to be really interesting. Now that we're in a coronavirus world, I really like the fact that this is from 1966. It's straight from the Ashrae handbook, Fundamentals Chapter 11. This is from 1966. I like some of the older stuff right now because we're all being bombarded with, and last week there's a new article on ... and there are some parts of science that are sound and sure. So this from 1966 shows the various deposition efficiency of particle sizes in the human respiratory system. So when I was talking about particles, viral particles or bacterial particles combining with other particles to be larger, this kind of, when I was reading and doing a lot of research, this kind of struck me because this kind of demonstrates that our respiratory systems are receptive to particles of all sizes, and there's a very high level of receptivity at the tiny viral size, and there's a very high level of receptivity also at the larger combined particle sizes. So really anywhere along that aerodynamic diameter, there is kind of a tendency for our respiratory system to take these particles in. And why that's important to me is because there's a lot of discussion about different technologies, and some of those technologies focus on making particle sizes larger, or that these large particle sizes that did get through our filtration system may not be as harmful because they'll drop faster. Well, that can be true, but they're still active for a period of time. So that's still an active viral particle or bacterial particle that's floating around in the space that your respiratory system is receptive to at these various sizes. So then I also came upon, same chapter, another article or another table. This one's from 1982. This talks about the diameter of various particles and then the settling time. So, the occupied zone defined as, excuse me, 3 inches above the finished floor to 72 inches above the finished floor. So about 6 feet, 2 meters. And then if you count into that, the air coming into the space is typically at least an 8 foot, potentially 9 foot, 10 foot ceiling. So the time it takes for that mixed air that may be up in the upper zones of the occupied zone or above to drop down can be pretty significant. So even in a very small particle size, or I'm sorry, in a very larger particle size, maybe an agglomerated particle size, let's just say 2 to 10, which would be very large, you're talking about a 128 to 6 minute to go 3 feet. So if that particle is still active, that's a fairly large amount of time to have active particles floating around within a space. You get to some of the tinier sizes. If you're just talking about the size of a viral particle and you're in the 0.01 range, you're talking 171 days. That's a lot of settling time. Not that I'm proposing that the virus is active that whole time, but that's the time it takes for a particle to settle. And again, another one that I pulled up, this is again prior to coronavirus. So right now I am based in Bozeman, Montana. I love it here. It's great. It's wonderful. Lived in Texas for a couple of years. Normally, I would say it's pretty hot there. Unfortunately, they're getting the cold that you guys are well used to. But when I was down there, there was a pretty significant outbreak of tuberculosis. So, tuberculosis can be spread in airborne droplets. There's also been recent outbreaks of measles, airborne by droplet spread, influenza, airborne. There are many of these that are transmitted either by droplet or just airborne transmission. And these are things that existed well before coronavirus did and were transmissible. So this is kind of, interesting to think about how global our economy has become, and we're all mixing in places with various types of vaccination right? Various traditions in the countries people are coming from and going to that might leave us exposed to pathogens within a space. So even if coronavirus was not the issue that it is now, this is important to kind of pay attention and maybe do our best when it comes to providing a disinfected space for us to breathe in. The current coronavirus that we're dealing with, the SARS-CoV-2, is very similar. While studies have shown that it has a very similar rate of disinfection, I guess UV disinfection dosage rate is very close, and very similar properties with regard to particle size and behavior with regard to how we filter it. So there are a lot of companies out there who are, pushing out studies and things. Many of them are on the SARS-CoV-1, which is fine. It's very much similar. And until very recently, we didn't have a lot on SARS-CoV-2. So more studies are now coming out and third-party validation is more available now. In the very beginning of the pandemic, there were some companies out there saying, hey, we've got coronavirus tested already. And it was, 2 or 3 months in. Those are typically studies that were done on like 229E or the HKU1 are the ones that I've seen. And these are other common human coronaviruses that most likely all of us have had or have been in contact with. They're not the more severe coronaviruses like the MERS, SARS, and SARS-CoV-2. So just important to understand what people are talking about and what similarities and differences whatever has been tested might be on. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind. This is straight from the CDC website, so public database. So other indoor air quality issues. I'm not going to do the service of reading off of a slide word for word. I apologize to miss out on that, but really this is just to point out, I leave this in here just to point out the fact that biological contaminants can come from different places. Like now we're talking about from people, but keep in mind things that people have traditionally used UV for, bacterial contamination on coils, mold contamination on coils. So those have all been things that we've used UV on in the past. But, a pipe breaks and there's, standing water. These are other ways that biological contaminants come into the building besides right at the coil. There's also outdoor sources that many times we take for granted. Oh, it's 100% outdoor air, so we don't need, to treat for any pathogens. I thought this to be true for a long time also, and I've learned otherwise now. A couple of examples: agricultural places in high density agricultural areas have the risk of consistent contamination from very fine dust and dirt particles being blown in with bacteria on them. And I've dealt with some food service clients that are in that exact situation where they're dealing with agricultural fields nearby, and they could not figure out why, for the life of them, after replacing their entire HVAC system, even replacing the roof membrane, because they thought they had a contamination, and then came back and they were still getting this specific bacteria, and it turned out it was coming in on the wind. So unless they wanted to put up a giant dome, they needed to address it another way. So they applied UV to the system and have had great success in providing clean air to the system and eliminating those pathogens. Also had a customer in Los Angeles that when the building that they were dealing with was designed, had plenty of space between their building exhaust and their intake. Their intake was sufficiently distanced from the ground. Everything was fine. And then recently a 2-story tent city has popped up nearby, and they have contaminants coming in from the new residents living right at the side of the building. So that was one I was not expecting. I was like, you've got outdoor air coming in. I'm not sure that you're going to need this in this case, and that was the conversation that was had. So just not to take for granted those assumptions that we sometimes make, that there might be applications out there where it's a perfectly appropriate fit to try to treat the airstream in those cases. So when people think about UV, this is traditionally what they're thinking of. They're thinking of coil cleaning. Even for me, up until, man, I took a job with UVDI just a couple months before the pandemic. And even up until that point, I had only clicked it on the box in a manufacturer software before to try to provide some level of coil cleaning. So this is still a very important reason to have UV. And, you know, being from the mountains and on the dry side of the mountains, I, you know, didn't really concern myself too much. I didn't see a lot of applications where we have tons and tons of mold growth in my dry climate. But, pardon me, what I did not account for was the biofilm growth that you can't really see, that is happening all the time when we have any condensation on a surface like this. So biofilm growth is actually worse for your system efficiency than even the blockage that mold can cause, because it starts as soon as you're done cleaning the coil, you start up your system and it's running. You have the potential for that biofilm to start growing on all the surfaces of your coil. And as it does, your coil loses that metal to air surface contact, and instead is a biofilm, which is not nearly as conductive as the metal. So you're losing your heat transfer efficiency through that biofilm growth. And it's not as visible, so it's disregarded. It's pretty highly disregarded as not a concern. And of course, the buildup of mold, number one, is an IAQ issue. It's not healthy to have these environments in our buildings. But also, yes, does block the coil. There are some studies that indicate you can get about a 15% savings on energy. You also get reduced maintenance costs, and you know, the life of your coil can be preserved a little bit. You're not having to use as caustic chemicals or as aggressive cleaning procedures. So all of that is, yes, absolutely important, both to indoor air quality and to overall, you know, building energy and maintenance issues. But this is also a breeding ground for other things that can be very dangerous, like bacteria. And despite having filtration downstream, we have run into some clients that had significant enough mold buildup on their coils that when they were changing the filters, they knocked mold into the system. And it was unfortunately in an operating room space, and there was loss of life. So these are things to be aware of when you're considering the use of UV in a system. Pardon me. So we get asked a lot, where's the best place to put it? So if your primary goal, the answer is always, what's the goal, right? Someone comes to you and says, I want to build a building. What are we trying to do here? So with the UV system, you find out what is your goal. Are you just looking for cleaning coils? The answer in the last year has changed almost exclusively to no. I want to provide airstream disinfection as well. So if their goal is only cleaning coils, then the best location is on the downstream side of the cooling coil, with sufficient space there to be able to space it far enough to have the irradiation cone from the lamp so that light be able to spread out and cover the fullest space of the coil possible. On the drain pan side, so you're able to irradiate the drain pan as well. Very best location. If they're talking about airstream disinfection and they have enough space there, that's a great place to locate it also, because then you can benefit from the coil cleaning while you're getting your airstream disinfection. If airstream disinfection is the only goal and they don't have enough space here, then the next best place is wherever we can get enough space to install the system for ease of maintenance and with the least likeliness for a lot of degradation of components. If there's a lot of plastics and components in an air handler, in a single cabinet of an air handler, that you might have to either tape off or provide UV resistant wrap or things like that for, that's maybe not the best location. Although we can provide assistance in helping deal with those situations, that's probably not the ideal. But the ideal is where we can get the right velocity also. So we can go into the duct for airstream disinfection applications. We can install in parallel with the airflow to increase the residence time with the lamp. But we really need to pay attention to those velocities first to get the right dosage. All right, so kind of laid the groundwork for a little bit of what UV, where we're going to locate it, what we're doing with why we're using it in air handlers, why we're looking at UV at all. I'm going to bounce back a little bit and talk a little bit about UV light itself and tell the UV story. So again, many of us were not that familiar with UV before. We understand, UVA and UVB, everyone does very well. We prevent against it for our own health and safety. UVA and UVB and UVC all come from the sun. And UVA and UVB, although much of it is blocked by the ozone layer, some of it is not. So we and other organisms have developed some defense mechanism against UVA and UVB. UVC, however, since none of it comes through our atmosphere, we and germs, other biological organisms, don't have any natural defense against UVC. This makes it a very effective germicidal agent. The highest level of effectivity is at just over 260 nanometers, but it's optimized, meaning best harnessed and provided at the right cost and safeties and all of those things. So optimized at the 254 nanometer wavelength, which is right near that peak of germicidal efficacy. This is where most UV suppliers, this is the type of lamp that most UV suppliers use, is the UVC at the 254 nanometer wavelength. There are other wavelengths being used in the 180 to 200, the vacuum UV, in that range, that are ozone producing. So there are some systems, I've seen it especially with photocatalytic oxidation systems that are out there in the industry, that their lamps are in that 180 to 200 range. That's not all. We see all different types of photocatalytic oxidation systems. That's just where I've seen it the most. And those are ozone producing. So just important to note, if it's in the 254 nanometer wavelength, there's no certification that says it doesn't produce ozone, because that's a physical impossibility for it to do so at that wavelength. So that's what UVC is. So we said it's effective against germs, but how does it actually impact them? So I mentioned earlier, I'm a nerd, so sometimes I can get too far in the weeds with this, but I'll try to cover the high level, the Cliff Notes version, so to speak. So coronavirus specifically is a single-stranded RNA virus. There are DNA viruses, double and single-stranded. There are RNA viruses, double and single-stranded. So coronavirus is this guy here, single-strand. In a DNA virus, there's an image down here. In a DNA virus, it's the adenine, or in a DNA strand, it's the adenine and thymine that are going to bind together. So as part of a biological process, an animal or human, an organism, there's a recombining of your DNA to complete cellular processes. So our DNA gets unzipped and then rezipped as our cellular processes move forward. When our DNA encounters a viral piece of DNA or RNA and it combines, then the virus takes over that process, and then it is able to reproduce and continue on with the viral process, the viral life cycle, and takes over your own DNA. So we want to avoid that happening. So how that's avoided, when UV enters, I'm sorry, when when DNA or RNA is exposed to UV, it creates what they call dimers. It's where the links on the chain are unable to, so the thymine and adenine in the case of a DNA virus, or the uracil in the case of an RNA virus, links to itself on its side of the chain instead of being open to link with another strand of DNA, your strand of DNA. So that severe damage, if it's severe enough, you get enough of these dimers, then think of it like a zipper. You're, getting ready to go to bed, you're out camping, and you go to zip up your sleeping bag, and if it's split a little bit, if there's just one link in the chain that's like this, that's broken, you can zip past it, and sometimes it even kind of fixes itself. But if there's a number of them in a row, it's going to be a cold night. So that's the goal, is to provide a high enough dosage of UV that you get enough dimers created that this becomes a useless strand of viral DNA and it's unable to bind with your DNA. So I mentioned the dosage being very critical for that reason. The dosage is a factor of intensity times time. The intensity is the lamp output itself, which is kind of a constant. I mean, there are lamps developed already by manufacturers. So that lamp output typically is expressed in like a standard output lamp or a high output lamp. So it's your lamp output times the quantity of lamps utilized. This is expressed, your intensity is expressed in microwatts per centimeter squared. And then time, just simply the seconds that any surface or the volume of air that's passing through is exposed to that irradiation. So the dosage that's required to inactivate, deactivate, kill, all these words are used, that's expressed in microwatt seconds per centimeter squared, or microjoules. So the dosage, if we provide just a little bit and don't get that right, then only one or two of these dimers is formed in this example here. Very few dimers are formed and it can repair itself. If we do get it right, the whole link is broken. It's unable to continue to replicate. So the lamp output, I mentioned standard and high output. So what you typically would see in an application like I used to use before, where I just click a box and clean a coil, you have a relatively infinite amount of time in that part of the equation. So balancing this equation, if you have a really high dosage required, like it's mold and it's like 300,000 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared required, but you have infinite time, your intensity can still be pretty low. Now you flip that, and if your time factor goes to 0.25 seconds as a volume of air is passing across the lamps, then your intensity is going to have to go way, way, way up. And so those lamps that were once selected to very effectively clean the face of a coil with a standard output of 84 microwatts per centimeter squared versus a high output lamp, which is more than double the intensity. So if you're going for a coil cleaning application, you might have, a couple of rows of lamps at that 84 microwatts per centimeter squared intensity. And that same system, if you wanted to bump that up to an airstream disinfection, you would probably have 5 to 6 times potentially the amount of lamps at double the intensity to be able to make up that part of the equation. There are some companies out there, UV companies, but also just, people have come out of the woodworks during coronavirus, trying to sell different technologies and ideas, and they aren't necessarily properly educating on the different aspects and appropriate use, and they're not having the right conversations about dosage. They're not talking about, they're providing a price or a promise before they even understand the equation. So in order to provide the right dosage, we need to understand the geometry of the unit. Dosage is very reliant not just on the output of the lamp, but the reflectivity. The way that, let me see, let's get to I need to go back. That's okay. I was gonna get a better picture of it. Your first look, so to speak, that light shining, its first pass onto the airflow is a high level of UV, and that's the most critical part of the dosage. But then every reflection back, so like galvanized is about 57% reflective, whereas stainless steel is about 28% reflective. So that 57% is considerably more reflective. So to be able to understand that when you're asking, hey, I need a system, I need a price on a system, or I need you to help me design a system, if they're not asking you like dimensions, material, relative humidity, temperature, things like this when you're trying to get a system designed, and they're making promises before they understand that system, it's really important to kind of get in that conversation and make sure that you're both on the same page. We've seen a lot of just misinformation throughout this era. And it's just really important to know that we're all on the same page that way. Airflow, because of the time factor of the equation, is very important also. So most installations prior to coronavirus, the coil cleaning type, were installed in perpendicular with the airflow, and any air volume passing by them usually was 500 feet per minute or less, because it was already limited by filtration and coils and humidifiers, things like that in the unit that can't be used at high velocity either. Now when we're applying it in the duct, a lot of people are asking us for quotes at very high velocities. We can accommodate for that. Like UV companies broadly can accommodate for that velocity, but really should keep it to, 1,500 feet per minute or less, realistically, where the quantity of lamps and the application of lamps starts to not make sense after that, because it's so much required to accommodate for that lower residence time with the lamp. So dosage is a really important part of UV to understand, because it is very scientific and there are very clear answers. We just need to understand all the factors to it. So this is a chart for the doses required for various pathogens. This comes from studies that are done in lab settings, and these numbers are provided and widely accepted and utilized in modeling throughout all the UV industry. So in this example, influenza A requires 4,558 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared. This is for a 99% inactivation rate. It is much easier to inactivate coronavirus. It requires about just over 1,900 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared. And really, really hard to inactivate Aspergillus niger or black mold at 330,000 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared. So another part of your design is understanding what your customer, what your end user, what are their goals? Are they trying to achieve, like my food service client, they were trying to achieve a 99.999 5-log reduction of E. coli. It wasn't E. coli, it was a different pathogen, but it had the same level of disinfection rate. So that required a lot of UV to be able to inactivate, but just understanding what your goals are, or what your customer's goals are. Pardon me. And then finally, there's a lot of different ways that all the different manufacturers use to install. These can be installed in the air handler or rooftop unit or in the duct. Most manufacturers offer some sort of structure to be able to support the lamps if they're installed in perpendicular configurations to the airflow in an air handler. They can be installed in the duct in parallel with the airstream, and in standard or high output configuration. Here's just a couple of images of UVC systems installed. I keep this in here to remind me to talk about safety. So our marketing department does a great job of touching up the lamps to make it look like they're on. The one on the left, she did a great job touching up. This is a duct mounted application. The customer put a very large access port for themselves, so it's really convenient to change. But these lamps the airflow passes by them and it has a longer period of time and more reflections off the duct. And so we can use less lamps in an application like this sometimes. So it's good application. This access door had a great safety disconnect. And when the customer provided this photo, the lights were off. So we colored them in blue. On the right, someone sent me this photo and was like, hey, look, it's all installed and running. So just a note of safety, we need to make sure to pay attention, just like we do with any other piece of equipment from any supplier, any type of technology we're using. We provide fan guards for fans, we provide disconnects for fan sections, disconnects for power, etc. So as with any technology, we need to provide safeties. So installing a disconnect switch on the door, and often also a power disconnect nearby also, so that if they're operating with the door opening and closing, that when the door closes, they're not in there with the lights reactivated. So a manual override switch and door switch is highly recommended. There are safe levels of established UVC impact, and so the current established level is 6,000 microwatt seconds per centimeter squared per 8-hour period. And you will get greater than that dosage in less than a second in an application like this, which the next picture I received after this was of a pretty good sunburn. So UV acts on the top layer. It doesn't penetrate deep through the surfaces. UVC does not. And so I guess the positive news is that although he had a pretty good burn on his skin, there's not a high level of cellular damage impact, but that's not really good. You know, that's not a good practice. So let's make sure we get our safety on there. And finally, just wrapping up, just touching on other ways that UVC is used in air treatment in systems. I mentioned earlier that some manufacturers utilize the vacuum UV, the lower, the 180 to 200 nanometer wavelength, which is ozone producing. Some manufacturers use 254 nanometer wavelength. Just pay attention to what's out there and what's in the manufacturer's listed performance, because ozone production is not ideal. But there are various ways that photocatalytic oxidation is utilized for air purification. One thing I have seen through the last year is a shift where there were companies that were providing VOC mitigation and odor mitigation, and before the pandemic, and then when the pandemic hit, they really jumped in on, hey, let's look at pathogen control a little bit more. Let's look at airstream disinfection a little bit more. And when this happened, it kind of confused some people. So if you're designing a system for airstream disinfection, you don't need photocatalytic oxidation. The active part of disinfection in that part is the lamp system. So if someone is trying to convince you that this whole system is necessary to provide airstream disinfection, you might want to look into that a little bit. If you have other needs in addition, like VOC mitigation and odor control, then this type of technology, ionization, photocatalytic oxidation, these types of technologies can be very effective at the VOC mitigation and odor control, but are not, that UV portion of it is the part that's actually inactivating the pathogen. So does anyone have any questions? Grab a drink.
Mindy, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
Can you pull that up on your end?
Yeah. Does UV mitigate smell associated with forest fire smell? Perfect. Yes, UV can actually impact VOCs without the photocatalytic oxidation, without any other technologies. It is capable of mitigating some odors. It's not as capable as a complete system with, you know, like photocatalytic oxidation or ionization or carbon filtration, but it can be helpful to mitigate some of the smell. Any other questions? Would the UV go before the induct humidifier? It can go either before or after, but you need to make sure that your absorption distance is observed and you're not putting it directly downstream of a humidifier where you know, condensation is going to become an issue. A high amount of condensation is going to become an issue, or droplets really would be more the issue. So I've seen it installed in both locations as long as you follow the absorption distance recommended by the humidifier manufacturer. Any other questions? I feel like an auctioneer. I gave that one pretty fast.
So
Hey, Mindy, this is sorry, Zen. This is Sam. I have a question on so how long do these lights last?
Sure. So depending on the manufacturer, they have different types of warranties. and make different claims, but most manufacturers utilize lamps from the same company, so it's kind of just a different way that they express it. But these lamps are mostly rated to last for about a year. It's 9,000 hours of continuous operation is what they're warranted for from lamp manufacturers, which most UV companies are using. So when you get to situations where you have dirty power, you've got a lot of power bumps, or constant intermittent operation where it's just cycling on and off and on and off and on and off, then it's about 4,000 hours of in continuous operation. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Yep, that did. Yeah.
Okay. It looks like another question, UV and return or supply. Again, you can locate it in either location. Velocity is what we really want to pay attention to. So if we can get enough space in the supply, that's better, because you're able to, you don't have to put any filtration before it, add any filtration to your system. In a return application, if you have, like filtered return or the ability to put filtration ahead of it, then it can be utilized pretty effectively in a return situation also. What you want to be careful of, I had one application that was a movie theater application that I went out to inspect, and all of the return ducts were completely just clogged, and they had cleaned them fairly recently too. So my concern was that the lamps would be coated and not be as effective in what they're trying to do. Hopefully that answers Dylan's question.
So what about LED lights? Are they becoming used?
Yeah, so LED, so there's a lot of different promising technology that just hasn't had enough time to be analyzed and third-party validated. LED is a promising technology, but right now, all the LED technology I've seen, it's not a high enough output in a reasonable amount of light, where the cost and the install and the replacement and all of that lines up to be an effective solution for a high level of airstream disinfection. So I think LED can definitely find a place in like a coil cleaning application where it has that infinite time, so you don't have to get those much higher intensities. But there's still, I think, some room, some work to be done with regard to any airstream disinfection. I've been seeing a lot of products come out with LED on them and incorporate it into their technology, like fans or filters or things like that. And it's going to provide a little bit of disinfection, but likely not to a degree that it's going to be as cost effective as maybe people are hoping for. So those are my 2 cents. I don't have all the data in on LED yet, but does that make sense?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay, there's other technologies too. So far UV, some may have heard of that. And again, very promising. Some of the ways that people are deploying it make me kind of wonder a little bit, like some tunnels that people are walking through. But again, we have to consider that number one, it's only affecting that top layer of cells. So if you're trying to disinfect a person that's coming in and they're just passing through it, you don't have a ton of time to disinfect, and the germs are inside them. So people might spend a ton of money on this tunnel, but if this person is carrying all these pathogens in with them and they cough once, they've just kind of defeated the purpose. But in like a lab situation or a situation where you might have some contamination and you have the time to come out and you're just worried about what's on the top surface level, not what's inside of someone or something, then there might be some positives there. But far UV is another promising technology that we have a lot of research to do. I see, does UV have any detrimental effect on filter media, plastics, rubber, materials found inside an air handling unit? Absolutely, it does. So I alluded to it a little bit earlier, but there are databases out there where UV companies and research labs have done a lot of research on different types of material. And the impacts vary pretty widely. So if you're applying in an air handler that has a lot of plastic components in that cabinet or filtration media. So with filters, it often doesn't matter much because the amount of time of exposure isn't going to be sufficient, like between filter changes. If someone's going to change them quarterly, you're not going to see a high level of degradation potentially, depending on the filter, but most filters won't degrade faster than you're changing them out. But it's important to understand what those filters are made of. Most manufacturers have some type of a device where they can deflect so that the UV is not shining directly on the filtration. And that can be helpful also if you have longer times between filter changeouts. Hopefully that answered that, but there are ways around that also. I've seen, people just, installing metal conduit to run wires through, UV resistant insulations, different foil tapes, things like that, that they're able to apply that are UVC resistant. Can you elaborate on the risks of UVC exposure to people in non-duct applications, upper rim? So glad someone mentioned that. I didn't even touch on upper rim. That's a great question. People on ladders and other incidental exposure, for example. It's like you read my book, Nathan. So I also think that upper rim is a great technology. Part of my background was in air distribution technologies. And so I kind of geek out about like the way the air mixes within a space. And certainly we have a lot of air mixing when we're breathing and our heat plumes are there and there's processes and things going on in the space. So I think the upper rim does show promise, but again, we get back to that, the payoff point where you have to weigh in how many passes across that UV it's going to take and the safety of having higher output lamps that might be more effective in that space, because you're exactly right. My recommendation would be to install motion sensors at just below the level where it's installed, because if you have deployed a UVC system up high and then you have, a maintenance person who's not familiar with the risks of UV up on a ladder a couple feet away, poking his head through the ceiling tile, he's probably going to have some negative effects from that UVC exposure. On the flip side, if you're using a low enough dosage of UV and the air is constantly moving, you may not have enough residence time with that light, if it's a low output, to really make as big of an impact as you're hoping for. So I think I would like to see a lot more research and understand that a little bit better. But yeah, thank you, Nathan. That's we see people popping up with their new ideas it's awesome to see innovation and awesome to see the intent behind it. People are really trying to help keep people safe, but they're deploying UV technology in pretty dangerous ways. I saw an application where someone just put a high output lamp across the ceiling with, probably like a 2-inch metal piece underneath it. So there wasn't direct light shining down, but yeah, I would not recommend that. So, is there a sweet spot or recommended air velocity feet per minute that the air distribution system should be designed for to maximize the efficiency of using the UV light to deactivate viruses, pathogens, or other pollutants? Yep. So the sweet spot is definitely the lowest velocity possible. So I've done a ton of modeling on different UVC systems and different airflow and geometry, duct geometry, air handler geometry. And it's really fascinating to me that I can run the same system, everything else being the same, and then drop the velocity. And there are points where we get around like 350, 400 feet per minute, where it reduces the quantity of lamps required by like maybe a quarter. And then on the flip side of that, gotten the velocity up to like 700 or 800, and we're having to double the lamps. So it does depend on the geometry, how many reflections we're getting and how that's impacting it. But the velocity sweet spot is under 500 feet per minute. In parallel, where you're installing parallel to the airflow, you have a little bit extra time with that extra residence time and the extra reflections along the duct. So typically, well, definitely under 1,500 feet per minute, but you're gonna, as engineers, you're probably gonna get a lot better situation if you increase the duct size for, you know, a 36-inch run or something, or find ways to locate this in a lower velocity, because even though it can be accommodated at those higher velocities, the 1,200, 1,400, 1,500 feet per minute velocities, keep in mind that those owners are changing those lamps out. So we just deployed a system that had something like 40 lamps in it to try to accommodate for those velocities, and it modeled out fine. We recommended against it. They still decided to go forward with it, and now that owner is going to be replacing 40 very difficult to reach lamps every year. So there's definitely the sweet spot to work out. You should, no matter what manufacturer you're working with, make sure they're asking those questions I mentioned and working with you to model the right approach, or to provide data on the right approach, that they're actually sizing it appropriately for what your goals are. So intensity monitoring to ensure performance. That is a good question also. Everybody's got good questions. So it's somewhat common, and it really depends on how facilities management is being handled. It's really situational, because UVC lamps are pretty simple devices. If your focus is airstream disinfection, they should be on anytime there's airflow moving through, or you're losing efficiency of that disinfection. So you can sequence the lamps with your fans. You can sequence with your building schedule, so that, you know, your system is on for a period before anybody comes to provide continuous air cleaning, and then after to provide additional air cleaning after, to get a full system, you know, pathogen purge, I guess you could say. But the intensity monitoring is really just dependent on the client's needs. So I've dealt with some like school districts that have very few facilities people compared to how many facilities they have. And so they have installed radiometers that just kind of monitor, so that they can get an idea of intensity, and that'll feed back to their BAS, so that they can tell whether or not those systems are actually being maintained, whether or not the lamps are being changed. So when that intensity is dropped down to 50% or something, it'll alarm the facility owner. And then we have some casino clients that have a lot of this equipment that they have 50 facilities guys to a very small facility, and they're just, it doesn't make sense for them, because they're constantly changing the equipment. So does it extend or shorten the life of the bulbs when they are turned off and on daily with an air handler when they're running on a schedule? It can shorten the life of the lamps if they are constantly cycling on and off. If it's just daily on and off with the air handling schedule, you will get some reduction, but it will still typically last a year. So we call it, 4,000 hours of intermittent operation, which is equivalent to like a 12-hour day every day for a year, roughly. Little more than that. So it turns into basically the statement of annual replacement in either case. If they're constantly on and off, then that's another story. If you have a situation where someone is demanding that their system is consistently on and off, or it's a process that's consistently on and off, I would highly recommend monitoring that system.